Good morning, Jaswant. It's lovely to have you here again with us for Threads 2022 to discuss a talk we've titled The Impact of Time and Space on Human Behaviors. And it's a delight that you're joining us again. If I can briefly introduce Jaswant, she's a professor at McGill University in the Department of Psychiatry and actually the head of child psychiatry. She's also director of Childhood Disorders Day Hospital at the Jewish General in Montreal. And she's also a cultural consultation person around, newcomers coming to Canada and their needs in terms of their well-being here. So welcome, and a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Maybe I should add that since COVID, I'm on leave from McGill, and I'm actually the only consultant for Indigenous child and youth children out here in Southern Vancouver Island, and the only consultant for the Refugee Center. So while I teach at McGill, I'm no longer doing active clinical service there at the moment. I'm on leave.
Okay, thank you very much for pointing that out. So I guess I'd like to start, if I may, by asking you about being a third-generation South Asian raised on Vancouver Island, as I understand. Could you tell us a little more about how your own experiences influenced your path to becoming a child psychiatrist and later in your capacities as you've worked at McGill in Montreal?
Well, it's sort of not a straight line as it is in most people's lives when we're working. But I must say that very early on in my life, I was already interested in being a doctor. And so even when I was very little, and I also was very interested in being an artist. And South Asian families find the idea of a girl being an artist completely alien. And the idea that at that time, when I was little, none of my family, in the women in my family, had gone up to even high school. So there were two kind of agendas. One was being South Asian and being Canadian, and also being very aware of the suffering of my community, and also of the very big gap between my community and what I would call the white settler community, and the complexities of it on South and Vancouver Island. Tremendous discrimination towards Indigenous people, the history of the Japanese internment, the positioning of the Chinese community here, and the so-called model minorities. So all of those things, and then personal things like my grandmother and grandfather. The grandfather came in 1906, and he was a witness to the Kamagata Maru incident. He was terrified by the White Canada movement, and my grandmother went psychotic when she came off the ship and was sent to Edsondale, had ECT without anesthetic. So, and I had a brother, and I do have a brother here with autism and brain damage. And so I learned many things from many places, and I couldn't say, well, this is the reason why I landed up there. Mm-hmm. I was very cosmic journeys in life are very interesting.
Yes, certainly they are, but it's also interesting, sort of the backgrounds we come from sometimes might direct or shape the way we see the world and what we want to do. My own background being from a mixed European or Euro-Asian European background, and that also sort of has influenced me in my interest in cultural studies. So if I could just continue then with perhaps if you could reflect on newcomer cultures to Canada today, and by that I mean immigrants and refugees, and this unfamiliar context in which families find themselves and how this influences or complicates raising children and the family's ability to adjust. So I just like to, before you answer that, just quote the World Health Organization and how it defines good mental health. And I quote, as being a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So that's coming from the World Health Organization. But how do you see, what are the challenges that newcomer families have to face in this new context in terms of raising children and settling?
Well, that's such a huge question. I couldn't possibly answer it. But I think that first of all, we always have to be in the here and now. So what we might have written 20 years ago has to be reconstructed into the dilemmas of our current world. What are the dilemmas of our current world? Migration is increasing. Global displacement because of planetary change, because of climate, because of technology, because of COVID, has changed our world. So the whole idea about how forced migration happens and what is the issue of the journey, what's the incentive at various historical moments in Canada, you have to take that into consideration. And whether my client might be pursuing refugee status here because they were terrified of the policies in the States, or they came up from El Salvador, or every journey is very different. And in the technological world, our family is who we can get in touch with, and also who's in our heart. And so we know that this continuous contact that technology allows us, or allows some of us, helps people who are in exile to maintain connection with people who they wish to be reunited with, or who are very important and dear to them. And so that changes how I do therapy and how I might think about things, but it doesn't change how I see a family. A family is the people you love or don't love, or are in conflict with, who are part of your generational history. And that could be many generations back too. Could be ghosts even. I have lots of ghosts visiting me in my family sessions. So how do these things construct? Well, I like Unger's formulation about children, and I like Paul Steinhauer's statement on this. Paul Steinhauer would say, don't make a decision about parenting capacity with a refugee family or any family that is in a state of uncertainty about whether they will be deported and what is their status and where will they be secure. So that he's very clear about that, and I absolutely agree with that. And I feel it's very dangerous for youth protection to start making decisions of separating children in that. So that's one statement that I think is very clear. The second would be looking at Unger's 7 tensions of across cultures and his extensive study, and thinking and reasoning that universally adolescents and young people, if we think of adolescence now as 10 to 27, okay, that is, it's no longer this limited arc, but the maturation step from school-age child to youth. He says, well, there are tensions and they get negotiated. They're about our meaning, they're about social justice, they're about identity, they're about material needs. And none of that should be assumed to be stereotyped. That is, the idea of giving anybody, a clinician, a framework, is to give them signposts for what they might want to know and what they might want the family to share with us are the predicaments and the changes and so you cannot tell a particular person, this is what you should go for. Sometimes the most important thing is I need a refrigerator. And sometimes the most important thing is my conflict with my grandfather. So that's the skill of being a therapist. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's too difficult a question to answer.
Thank you. It does partially, and it gives strong indications of where we might look in terms of Unger's 7 tensions and the other issues that you mentioned. And so I would also like to ask then, for example, about education, and then who is responsible for educating the educator. So teachers in schools, like this seems to be more of a multifaceted and intertwined question, because it's not just about maybe the psychiatrist or the caseworker. It's more also about education and how we come to develop our worldviews through education. So what role might, it's starting at school, because also children are going to school, newcomer parents have to negotiate with the school. So it's about not only social workers and psychiatrists, but teachers, community leaders, the overall working for the benefit of the youth and the family. And I assume that's together, never separate. So are there any specific issues that you could discuss with the plethora of subjectivities?
There are many. And if we think about education, certainly the day treatment center that I headed for a very long time as a director with children who couldn't function in school in the age group of 5 to 12, that the school was a vital part of our work. And sometimes the problem was the school, frankly. So that we had to be very sensitive and understand this is partnership with community. How does partnership with community work if 25% of the Black children land up in youth protection, representing, that much of Badshaw, of the English Montreal group home admissions? What does it say about what goes on in schools and who gets expelled and who doesn't? And how open are you to even understanding the history of African migration and Caribbean migration and the heterogeneity of it, and what it's like to come to a settler society that has a marked amount of institutional racism and interference with help seeking? So those are broad questions, which are like really glaring. Okay, there's one multicultural consultant in the whole of Victoria for all of the school boards. Now that to me is a very good example and reflection of what is involved in development from age 5 onward, that involves multiplicities of imaginations. And this is not something that teachers are equipped to actually with training or background or even sufficient counseling support. If we think about Paulo Freire and what he brought with liberation theology, and also as part of the issue of South America, but if you think of South America as being an incredibly diverse society, and Paulo Freire, I thought, really brought this forward about educators. Education ought to be a creative experience that is as creative for the teacher as it is for the student. And we have a long way to go before we actually think that way in terms of holistic well-being, resilience, the agency and voice of children. How much of the voice of children do we even include in child research? Very little. And it's very difficult to get those studies through the ethics committee because they're not used to thinking about children as agents of their own destiny. And we've had terrible difficulties actually getting it through. And when I worked in Jamaica, and Dr. Hickling said, we have a terrible problem because by the time the children reach adolescence in our society, they often are dropping out. There's high rates of conduct disorder, terribly high rates of witnessing violence and sexual abuse, etc. What are we going to do for these children? Should we start at adolescence? And I said, no, that's way too late, Fred. We have to start in school because there's certain services that you can give before 4, but school is the next opportunity for mental health. School is community. And so how welcome are the students? Well, Jamaican parents never wanted to hear from a school because all they'd ever hear was criticism. You're a bad parent. And that's a way a lot of immigrant people can perceive the school. And I know they don't speak my language. They don't bother to have an interpreter. Sometimes my child is the interpreter. And why do I get called? Well, because there's a problem. Not as an outreach and say, I'm part of your community. The school is part of your community. And you as parents are welcome to be integrated into it because all of you are individuating at the same time. And so this is, I think we have a long way to go before we really recognize the potential of schools to be real partners in mental health. and how terribly sad it is for me that these things are siloed, that primary care is over here, schools are over here, and mental health is over here, and the ER of psychiatry is over there. It's a terrible system as far as parents are concerned. Anyway, that's my initial comment on that.
Yeah. Thank you. I would have to agree with you, I think. And, there's a lot of perhaps essentializing specific cultures with teachers in school because they may not have enough, experience or background knowledge to be able to see that there are these, multiple psychohistoriographies and a multiplicity of people that are not heterogeneous homogeneous in their own cultures and backgrounds, and they bring with them maybe looking across time and space ideas about child raising that might be couched in the 12th century all the way up to negotiating with the 21st century. If I briefly think of my own cultural background on my father's side, there were ideas maybe that were wouldn't be considered part of his century, but yet he was born and raised in Canada. So I'm wondering about, how this starts with the child just at birth and the relationship between the mother, perhaps, with the child. I think I've seen you speak in another video about just our ways of caring for children, even having an infant in the same bed with the mother, for example. Could you talk a little more about maybe alternative strategies or strategies that we can perhaps learn from rather than placing our own, let's say, Eurocentric vision on how we see other cultures, child raising practices?
Well, I think that goes back to the issue of how ethnocentric our training is and how ethnocentric our literature is about child development, because it's not like there isn't a complementary literature from anthropology, from sociology, and from clinical sources that indicates to us how complex it is, this negotiation of different imaginations, and how everybody in a family can have a different imagination. And that wonderful book, When the Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, using Kleinman's questions with the little girl from Cambodia and the Hmong girl, about what kind of mediation is sometimes needed between institutional care, like the wonderful pediatrician or the wonderful teacher, but who is embedded in a very particular kind of training, and silos that from well-being, so that we don't think of ourselves as adventurous people who are going on an uncertain journey when we meet a family, to first of all get to an emotionally safe space where I can actually tell you what I really think about why bad things happened to me and to my child. And what are those cultural explanations? And well, who is this baby that came, and how are the ancestors involved in this, and so on? Because just because I have beliefs from the 12th century doesn't mean those beliefs are not perfectly appropriate and very sound in the right place. And if we think about how disrespectful we've been about indigenous knowledge, and the indigenous people are telling us, we must think 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind before we intervene in the landscape. The land is a spirit. They are using knowledge that it goes way back. And if you listen to Joe Gahn talking about the healing of the tremendous amount of suicide and despair in indigenous people, he says we can't use the tools of the settler. We must use our own tools and our own knowledge. And this is where people gathering our medicines at that wonderful work that's being done at Naples with Denise Finley, this idea of now respecting that there are multiplicity of healing methods. And that certainly in our team, we often have elders and we often have indigenous people off the reservation or from the community advise us and form part of the healing circle. This is a part of respecting that there are very important vestiges which may be very important in trying to find out what suits that family in arriving at a decision of strength.
Yeah,
not from us, but from them, putting them in that position.
Yes, very good point. And that brings me to another point, which is a recent, very important change that happened here on the prairies with the Cowessess First Nation. So they've very recently, after the discovery of graves this summer, taken back the responsibility for their youth development from the state, which we hope is going to be a positive development, or a self-care strategy, if you will. And that's taken years and decades from Cindy Blackstock, for example, struggling, and among others, for that right. How do you see that as being a positive change, perhaps a step in the right direction for Indigenous youth care?
Well, I think it's part of this wonderful optimism I feel since COVID, in shattering this absolute denial in the settler society that we are a very racist society. And so I want to first say that, because the wonderful report in plain sight that the Judge Turpel Lafond released, and can be downloaded from the internet by anybody, had very clear recommendations in it about what we have to do in healthcare to make our whole approach to Indigenous people address the racism issue. And this is there's already a prelude of information, of evidence that we have to decolonize ourselves. And so I see this step as part of decolonization. And in the decolonization, then we are up against, well, how much encouragement have we given to the Indigenous people to enter social work, and supported the children through high school so that they can take over their own services? Well, it's when we had lawyers who were Indigenous, and when we had professionals who were Indigenous, that this moved forward. That is, they are the advocates, and they are the visionaries, and we as the allies of that group need to be aware and sensitized in our schools, in our universities, that it is our responsibility to help those who are in minority positions, including the Indigenous people, to achieve their maximum potential. And so that's the issue that I think is there.
Well, very good that they've made those strides. It's about time. I would like to comment, though, that what we often see, or sometimes see, in newcomer cases, however, is, again, because of sort of a centralizing of a specific culture, and maybe misreading the context in which a case should come about. We have seen, actually, where children are removed from the home, or the family is split. And that's really quite worrisome, because actually the newcomers come here for a better life, and for better lives for their children. And when their children fall into this, space where they might be taken and put in homes, isn't this kind of a repetition, in a way, of what we did to the Indigenous? And how can newcomer communities perhaps find strategies to protect themselves against a caseworker, social worker, entirely misreading the situation, and then actually doing more long-term harm to the family and to the youth?
Well, I'm sure you and I have seen many situations like this where, in fact, the harm was done. And teams, well-meaning, unwitting prejudice, if you want to call it that. I call it institutional racism, but we can call it unwitting prejudice. That is, it's a decision that the worker takes. But there's a climate. You see, there's a political climate in which the worker also exists, and they also exist within the climate of each of their institutions. And what they're responding to. And for example, I remember when the suicide, the murder, actually, of the 3 women in the Muslim family in Ontario happened, and so on, that this kind of anxiety went up in youth protection in Quebec, that we had missed this. We had missed this girl's plea that she was at risk in her own family. And in the interest of that mistake, they came down very hard on other families. where it wasn't really appropriate because the anxiety increased that it was your fault, youth protection, that girl died. And so there are political waves also that we have to think about, and rigidity set in when there are waves and we aren't free to think and actually process things. So we have to be very careful. And of course, mediation between worlds and having places of safe discourse in supervision for social workers, for teachers. It's unheard of. For social workers, it's very limited. Anything equivalent to how to use an interpreter and how to use a culture broker. Is your team safe for discussion of re-looking and reframing at something that looks primitive to you or symbiotic to you or whatever these pathologizing words might be on otherness, and actually getting to know a family and connecting with beliefs. So this is a long range issue that should concern us all, because we are a country of hybridities. We are a country of many and multiple imaginations. And this is going back to this idea of Paulo Freire that education has to be a creative act.
I very much appreciate Paulo Freire's work and the idea that we don't just take bank knowledge. We just go and as if you're pressing buttons at an ATM and just take out the knowledge, but it's about the creative reciprocal processes. So yes, very well, articulated there. It's also quite sad to think that, if newcomers are being brought to Canada and are the future of Canada in some way, the youth are the future, it's quite shocking to know that in that political environment you were talking about, that only 1% of the budget apparently goes to helping youth through the community, and largely there's a lot of, focus instead around medication being prioritized over community programming and community development for specific groups. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that, because we often expect newcomers to be so resilient. They've come from so many difficult things, or they've gone through this process of migration. They're very resilient, but surely there has to be conditions made to continue to be resilient.
Well, survivorship isn't resilience, and I really think we have to be very careful about that word, because it's constantly used to describe the Cambodians and other people who keep working despite their great traumas. And aren't they resilient? Aren't the Indigenous people resilient because they actually survive? But this is, to me, a kind of a false use of the word resilient. They're carrying their pain in ways that they can cope with it. They're carrying the issues of discrimination in a way that they can survive it. There's a great deal to learn about being aware of how strong people are in surviving violence and in surviving discrimination. And those worlds and that knowledge, we often have more access to in a film or in a novel than we do in the social worker's office.
Good point.
So we have a way to go to kind of really understand attunement to those complexities. And social workers are in a very difficult position, and primary care, because they're not trained necessarily to do that. They maybe get one lecture in their whole training on diversity in families. And how are they supported, and how is primary care supported? And as you say, if community engagement, I think that was the point of the Access program, to open up access to youth from 10 to 27 to a walk-in kind of facility. It's an experiment in Canada. It came out of the work in Australia and so on. And it's just beginning, this idea that young people need to be able to access services, and that first episode, psychosis in particular, was the starting point of it. But most young people are suffering from anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, not first episode. But it's an experiment in how do we allow for help seeking that engages community? And what is the age of consent for you to exclude your parents? And how does a school help this predicament? And what does social media have to do with it?
Yeah.
And why do we reach for the Prozac rather than understanding what's going on in the family? I need so many youth who have been in the system and nobody has done a family history, and nobody has seen the family because everything is oriented to the individual. And I feel those are things which I guess need a lot of support and discussion, because it's really very much a CBT or emotion or one size fits all family approach. I find that very detrimental in training. Training ought to be eclectic. It ought to be broad for such engagement. And I think COVID is helping us. I think I'm so optimistic at this point that we are engaging in critical thinking about well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And critical thinking about the word resilience as opposed to survivorship, and critical thinking about how institutions themselves could foster help-seeking adaptations and the availability of interpreters and all of these things, and as allies. So this is, to me, it's about time. And it's wonderful to see that finally people are uncomfortable about it. I'm so happy because out of the discomfort may come new thinking.
Yeah. Very good. And out of every darkness, or there's a crack, and maybe it lets the light in, as I think Rumi would have said something to that effect. But I wanted to just underscore again the point about, not just the individual youth, but also the parents and the community being involved to a certain extent, because the parents themselves come with whole sets of hopes, and then they have often their hopes dashed in terms of financial issues, where to get the right kind of work, if they get the right kind of work, and all of these stressors on the parents also play a great deal into how they approach the children. I mean, if they're stressed working two or three jobs and they're menial poor jobs, that certainly doesn't give them the opportune time to raise their children in the way they might have liked. I just wanted to return maybe with one or two more questions, as I don't want to take too much of your time. But you've discussed on several occasions the idea about being creative. And artistic practice, self-expression, feeling a sense of, it's a sort of a cathartic moment that through art there can be a great deal of therapy. And I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit more to how that might be facilitated at multiple levels, maybe in the school, in the community, and in other practices for the youth.
Well, I don't think, I mean, certainly in my work, always with children, art and healing go together. And I really feel very strongly about that. And certainly I've seen some wonderful work in Jamaica using psychohistoriography and creative methodologies, poetry making, art making, and drama. And actually, if we think about Jamaica recovering from the post-slavery genocide, that Rex Nettleford, who was one of the first chancellors of the University of West Indies, started the National Dance Theatre, and that's where Fred Hickling actually started to learn about theatre and healing through the body, and these things are very, very. These things have been there for centuries as an access point. But you see, every good thing has to be thought out. Where are the spaces where this could be useful? How can the community be part of that? Is it part of a wellness project and not part of a pathologizing envelope at all? How do you integrate it into your work with children as a normal part of it? And if schools keep on cutting the budgets for music and art and all of these things, that's very sad, because this is a tool you can use for life. And how do we actually devalue children and actually interfere with them having confidence that they can have this agency for their whole life, because they're criticized, or because there's a particular way that you say making art applies to, you have to do it this way. Or so we have to also be careful about how and what is the cultural safety of such spaces, and how can it be facilitated. And it can be facilitated. I've seen it be wonderful in certainly the work that we do singing together. If you think about churches and how people engage people with singing, there are so many things which are group, and there are other things which are hermetic, which are really about our inner world and privacy. So the novel writer and journaling and poetry making and so on. So these are all healing spaces. I would call them like temenos. That is, they are kind of sacred internal spaces that we have access to, but they also have collective possibilities, especially for youth and children. So I think we're having to be a little bit more thinking out of the box, believing in community, believing in families, okay, and in the options. And that's why school is so important, because we can't put this all on families. Families send their children to school hoping that they will get the skills they need in life. And one of the skills is survivorship and well-being.
Yeah.
And so the parents can do a good enough job, the best they can, under the circumstances. As you say, they maybe have their own burdens, but I think most parents want the best for their children, and then they encounter things that they can't deal with. They can't deal with substance abuse or the vulnerabilities of their boys, which are different from the vulnerabilities of their girls, and the influences of peer group and how important that becomes in North America. Much more important than the influence of the family, which is a big shock to collectivists.
That's right. That's very true. It's all about the individual,
that's right.
As opposed to the collective. Absolutely. And the adolescent sort of almost expectation that you misbehave, act up. And oftentimes, I guess newcomer families would be far more interested in having their children focus on their studies. And here there's more of a focus on, the socialization, teamwork, sport aspect, which has some limitations, some possibilities, but also some limitations. So this has been a fascinating talk, and I'd just like to again remind all of us that the whole base of Canada, on immigration and bringing newcomers, and those newcomer children are really our future. And so if we mess up with our children, we also kind of mess up on our future. Or we miss opportunities. So I think it's, again, so important that youth and their families be able to thrive and flourish. And yes, Paulo Freire's tactics and ideas around learning, pedagogy of the oppressed, perhaps we all need to relook at that work again. So thank you very much, Jaswant, for the discussion. And we wish you all the best out in Vancouver Island and with all your future projects that you should take on.
Thank you so much for having me.